part of Jacksonville's history of which we are not very proud is that of segregation. But the reality is that for a period of time there were virtually two cities, a white Jacksonville and a black Jacksonville. Each of these communities had its own churches, its own schools, its own forms of entertainment, its own doctors and hospitals, its own business districts, and its own sense of pride.
James Weldon Johnson was born in Jacksonville in 1871, but it would be a number of years before Johnson would learn of racial prejudice. Jacksonville was then known as a good town for Negroes. This was a period of Reconstruction. Remnants of the Civil War could be found in any boy's collection of rusty bayonets, old belts, and brass buttons. This was the time when a good Negro baseball team was a tremendous drawing card for large audiences of whites and blacks. A black doctor, a black municipal judge, black merchants, land stewards for the steamship company, policemen, and city councilmen were part of the social fabric. In his autobiography, Along This Way, Johnson described the Jacksonville of his childhood.
I was born June 17, 1871. Jacksonville at that time was little more than a village. Bay Street, then the main street, turned its back, as it still does, on the St. Johns River, and from the rear of a row of 5 or 6 blocks of low wooden and brick buildings, several rickety wharves jutted out into the magnificent stream. Of course, waterfronts had not yet entered the list of civic responsibilities. From the river, the town extended back 8 or 10 blocks and straggled out on the 3 sides. North and west of the town was a forest of tall pines, and to the east, where the river makes a bend northward before taking its course to the Atlantic, there was a thick grove of oaks.
He writes about himself that when he grew up in Jacksonville, it was the best of times. It was during the Reconstruction period, so it was a time when blacks felt good about himself, and to be born during that time has to be really be great. And he was born to special parents, middle-class family, educated, and I think some things did concern James Weldon Johnson about Jacksonville.
Perhaps Johnson sensed that things would change. Perhaps Johnson was concerned that although there were schools for black children, a high school education was still not available without leaving the area, as Johnson had to do. Johnson returned to Jacksonville with his degree and became the principal of the school where he had started. Recognizing the need for a local black high school, Johnson added a grade level each year he served at Stanton until the high school was complete. He and his brother Rosamond composed a special song in honor of the first graduating class. Little did they suspect that this song would become known as the Negro National Anthem.
I can remember when I was a girl, those words, we learned those first. I think I learned Lift Every Voice and Sing when I was in kindergarten. And at one of the verses that I liked best was probably the last one. That's very, you sing it like a prayer almost. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in your arms, we pray.
During Johnson's time, Jacksonville had experienced many changes. Tourism had flourished, died back, and flourished again. The Civil War was over, and former slaves were now free. Reconstruction brought black representation in government, as well as the carpetbaggers and the scallywags. Epidemics of smallpox and yellow fever had broken out, decimating portions of the population. The people of the city had faced much adversity and many challenges. The new Republican government was regarded by some as an artificial creation by outsiders. Others saw it as a chance for change. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress to help newly emancipated blacks, had opened 3 schools in Jacksonville, as well as the largest Freedmen's Bank in Florida. Black representation in government became fairly common. A prominent member of the black community and a contemporary of Johnson's was Eartha Mary Magdalene White. Although not political, she received national recognition for her humanitarian work. Many newly emancipated blacks found themselves in office. But this post-war period of grace was short-lived. In 1876, Reconstruction ended and a period known as Redemption began, in which conservative whites returned to power. When a new state constitution was written, devices such as poll tax and literacy tests were included to take the vote away from blacks. Although many black citizens throughout Florida did lose their vote, some Jacksonville blacks, many of whom were property owners and educated, were able to retain their voting status. A new city charter was established in 1887, which restructured the government and annexed the suburbs of East Jacksonville, Springfield, Brooklyn, and Riverside. But with the yellow fever epidemic of 1888, the mayor and other public officials fled the city in panic. Volunteers stepped in to help this floundering government. As Jacksonville struggled with its local government, the United States declared war on Cuba in 1898. Although the Spanish-American War was short-lived, regiments of troops camped out on Ionia Street in the Springfield area, as well as in Pablo Beach, now Jacksonville Beach. Colonel William Jennings Bryan came to Jacksonville and was the commander of the 3rd Nebraska Volunteers. A signal station was erected at Fort George Island, but no Spanish warships were sighted. Soon hostilities ended, the peace treaty was signed, and the troops departed. And then, at the turn of the century, Jacksonville faced the greatest disaster in all its history. At 12:30 p.m. on May 3, 1901, a moss fiber factory located at Beaver and Davis Streets burst into flames. The roof of the building collapsed, sending incendiary particles in all directions. The fire quickly swept towards the business district and into the residential neighborhoods. The parish hall of the First Presbyterian Church burned quickly, as did homes and public buildings. As the fire approached Hogan's Creek, the wind shifted, causing it to move south towards the river. The smoke and flames which filled the Jacksonville sky could be seen for miles. Within 8 hours, everything in its path was destroyed. 146 city blocks had burned. Over 2,000 buildings were destroyed. 10,000 people were left homeless. Property losses exceeded $15 million. Every public building, except one, had been destroyed. This was the greatest disaster in all of Jacksonville's history. It was indeed an awful visitation. Community response was immediate. By the next morning, an extensive relief and rebuilding program had begun. Relief committees were formed. Donations were sent in from all over the country. Commissaries were set up to dispense food, clothing, bedding, and carpenter's tools. Tents were set up on vacant lots for temporary shelter. H.L. Mencken, then a cub reporter of the Baltimore Morning Herald, arrived within a week with 2 railroad cars full of relief items. The people of Jacksonville began rebuilding their city, and the city grew at an unprecedented rate. Springfield, which had not been damaged by the fire, experienced a tremendous surge of growth. The city population increased from over 28,000 in 1900 to over 57,000 by 1910. And within that decade, an entirely new city was built. A New Yorker named Henry Clouthier and other notable architects designed commercial and residential structures in a new style, which became known as the Prairie School of Architecture. By 1913, Jacksonville's population had grown to more than 85,000. W. Douglas, city editor of the Metropolis, reported, "No city in the world ever recovered faster and better, and this fact alone amazes the home folks and the strangers." A decade after the fire, many felt that the city of Jacksonville was greater and better than ever. This was the new Jacksonville.
Well, I've always been emotionally tied to Jacksonville because I've lived here all of my life and many generations of my family before me. My father was involved as a very young man in the first runs of the old ocean-going tug known as the Three Friends, which his cousin Napoleon Bonaparte Broward designed and built. And my father, until 1940, was on the St. Johns River every day of his life. And then for the last 26 years of his life, he was the engineer of the ferry boat Fletcher, which ran from the south side of the St. Johns River to the north side.
Steamship and riverboat travel was very popular on the St. Johns. Side-wheelers and paddle-wheelers took people down to Green Cove Springs, Palatka, and Lake Monroe. The Clyde Line provided steamship service between Jacksonville and New York for more than half a century. Jacksonville also became known as the world's winter film capital. Hundreds of movies were made here each year. Calum Studios, one of the first motion picture studios to maintain its own salaried actors, directors, and crews, was located on Talleyrand Avenue. Clouthier set up a studio in Springfield next to his house. Oliver Hardy got his start here when he was hired temporarily when a fat boy was needed for a comedy role. Many stars came to Jacksonville to make films, including Lionel Barrymore, Ethel Barrymore, and Victor Moore. It was not uncommon to see camera crews on the streets. By 1916, there were at least 30 firms with studios employing 1,000 part-time and full-time actors. The first Technicolor film ever produced was filmed in Jacksonville, with a specially equipped Pullman car being brought in to process the film. But the romance between Jacksonville and the motion picture industry began to sour. Residents complained when bank robberies were filmed during Sunday morning church services, when false fire alarms were set off to bring out the fire trucks, and when chase scenes went through the center of town, endangering the safety of the citizens. One stage mob scene got out of control when a saloon and a 2-story building were nearly destroyed. The movie people, on the other hand, disliked being charged outrageous prices for the privilege of using a private home as a backdrop. They complained of the high cost of goods and services. The antics of the movie makers became a political issue in the mayoral election of 1917. When Mayor Bowden, who supported the motion picture industry, lost his bid for re-election, the industry began moving out, and Jacksonville residents had few regrets. As attention turned toward World War I, the movie industry lost a prime market in Europe, and the people of Jacksonville lost interest in the movies. The construction of the Mayport jetties before the turn of the century had opened the port of Jacksonville to shipping. A number of ships, wooden, concrete, and steel, were constructed at local shipyards during the war. Camp Johnston, now the Naval Air Station, was designated a remount station for 27,000 officers and enlisted men. Concern about German submarines off the coast ran high. Mass meetings were held and public safety committees were formed. Jacksonville residents were prepared for war, but the threat was short-lived, and Jacksonville citizens turned their attention to matters at home. In the summer of 1917, people began to question the need for a bridge across the St. Johns River, and the first in a series of bridge debates was launched. Nevertheless, advocates for the bridge put the issue on the ballot, and in July of that year, Duval County voters approved the sale of a $950,000 bond issue for the construction of the Jacksonville-St. Johns, now the Acosta Bridge. This bridge, which spans the deepest water in Florida, was opened in 1921 with a gala 3-day celebration. Completion of the bridge opened the South Side to development. 2 years earlier, the Union Station on Bay Street, replacing the old 1897 railway station, had opened without fanfare. Described as a magnificent structure, this terminal was the most modern type possible, and equal to any station in the world. The excellent rail system contributed to the good distribution from the port. The terminal remained in operation for 45 years before closing its doors to passengers. The railway and shipping industry continued to grow, and Jacksonville became a major distribution and export center.
When I was a boy, the downtown Jacksonville riverfront was wars for commercial vessels coming in, unloading bananas and various things, taking them off. The Clyde Mallory line, for instance, had its boats coming in here and running to Philadelphia and New York and so on.
The 20s was indeed a period of unprecedented growth and prosperity, otherwise known as the Florida boom. The value placed on buildings increased dramatically. A number of skyscrapers were built along West Adams Street. To the south, a $6 million development called San Marco was announced. The residential developments of Lake Shore, San Jose, Lake Forest, and Venetia were started. Pablo Beach, experiencing increased land sales, was renamed Jacksonville Beach, and there was talk of building a second road to the already popular area. Many industries found Jacksonville attractive, and a strong commercial base with a diversity of interest was established. It was this economic diversity that helped the people of Jacksonville weather the storm of the Great Depression better than many other urban areas.
On the south side was a separate city, South Jacksonville, where I grew up. And it didn't become part of Jacksonville until the early 30s. I would sometimes, as a child, take a rather alone walk down Bay Street in front of all of the bars and learn many things about life, many foreign languages from the sailors in port, prostitutes, gamblers, you name it. It was an alive city because all of this matrix was made of a cross-section of the world that were coming into Jacksonville. The city grew at this unprecedented and unbelievably creative rate with this ambiance of really beautiful and far-reaching architecture, which was published and was known all over the United States. And here was this local man and a group of other architects creating unbelievably beautiful and wonderful things that the locals didn't quite understand, but other places were publishing. And people were coming here to see it.
Jacksonville did attract many well-known visitors. Many black entertainers came to town. Jacksonville resident Charlie Singleton wrote the popular Strangers in the Night, among others. Between the 20s and the 40s, Ashley Street was the hottest black entertainment spot in Jacksonville. In 1943, Mrs. Annabelle Remley composed a song about Jacksonville. It was first performed by her son, Harris Remley, in his senior year at Lee High School. Later recorded by Billy Butterfield and Keeley Smith, Mayor Frank Whitehead proclaimed the Jacksonville Blues, Jacksonville's official song.
I'm going right back to Jacksonville.
The early 40s brought the Navy in preparations for World War II. German saboteurs were arrested after planting explosives in the sand dunes at Ponte Vedra Beach. Shipbuilding increased. Because of the cold winters in the north, shipbuilders could not work long. But in Jacksonville, warships could be constructed 24 hours a day, 12 months a year. Before the war's end, Jacksonville shipyards would build more than 100 Liberty ships, tankers, Victory ships, minesweepers, and PT boats. The end of World War II brought peace and prosperity to Jacksonville.
This is Jacksonville, your city. Gateway to Florida, potential metropolis of the Southeast. It's a city that is just winding up a decade of phenomenal growth and just starting out on another one. In its fine natural harbor stretching along the banks of the beautiful St. Johns River, there is both shipping and shipbuilding. A steady flow of motor traffic back and forth across a modern four-lane bridge. Downtown in the shopping and business district, there's an endless hustle of activity, an air of prosperity. The crowd moves with sure purpose along the busy streets, looking as though they know where they're going, know how to get there, and are in fact already on their way. All of it says plainly and quite proudly, this is Jacksonville, city with a future.
The boom years of the 50s followed. Another surge of growth occurred, although scattered and unplanned. Arlington's population exploded when the John E. Matthews Bridge, the original bridge to nowhere, was completed. The Fuller Warren Bridge also opened in the early 50s. In 1955, the Florida legislature created the Jacksonville Expressway Authority to build and maintain the first expressway system in the state, with responsibilities for more than 125 miles of expressway and highways and 4 bridges. Jacksonville was expanding. The downtown riverfront was changing from a setting of wharves and warehouses for commerce to a cityscape of skyscrapers, bridges, and parking lots. City with a future. But were we neglecting a part of our present? Where were the residents that had found Jacksonville to be a good town for Negroes at the turn of the century?
I came to Jacksonville 70 years ago when my community of Jacksonville was strictly a divided city. White, black, white, black. Segregation was rampant. I lived in a building on the east side of Jacksonville, 1 block from Main Street. And on the corner of Main and Union, there was a restaurant. What segregation had taught me was so uncalled for, because when I went into the store to buy a sandwich, I ordered it, The girl went into the back to prepare it, and I thought I would sit down until she came back. But the gentleman came out and said that I couldn't sit down. So therefore, I told him to keep his sandwich.
Jacksonville was segregated, and it would be some time before strides were made toward an integrated society. As is true throughout Jacksonville's history, no significant changes were made without a struggle. Rutledge Pearson became the major force in the fight for human rights in Jacksonville. Committed to the cause for freedom, he dedicated his life to his work.
We live by the philosophy that none of us can be free until the lowest one among us is free. I'll be sitting up there, I'll be sitting up there, well, just come on up to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting up there. You know the word, sing the verse now.
Described as the Martin Luther King of Jacksonville, Rutledge Pearson met an untimely death in a car accident in 1967. Mary Singleton and Sally Mathis were the first two black city council representatives since Reconstruction. They were joined by attorney Earl Johnson in 1968. But the struggle wasn't easy. Janet Johnson explains.
Just during that time, we had a couple of race riots, and he was the NAACP lawyer for the state of Florida. That meant he was in court long hours, and I wasn't sure whether he was still in court or whether he was killed or what. It was very difficult times.
Times were difficult. Like other southern cities, the implications of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education were not being addressed. In 1964, 15 Duval County schools were disaccredited. But the disaccreditation had not come without warning. These and other problems may have been symptomatic of an ever-deepening crisis in local government. City and county officials were either unable or unwilling to address numerous urban problems. A month after the high schools lost their accreditation, Claude Yates, president of the Chamber of Commerce, called a meeting of 23 Jacksonville business and civic leaders to study the problem of local government. A one-sentence request was sent to the Duval County delegation, asking them to sponsor legislation to establish a local government study commission. This document, later called the Yates Manifesto, opened the door for restructuring Jacksonville's government. The study commission was organized October 1st, 1965. It would be several years before consolidated government would become a reality, and not without struggle.
We were here forcing it to change, and we were here to enjoy the change. My husband served as secretary to the committee who wrote the new government, the new consolidated city government of Jacksonville, the bold city of the South. And so we were a part of this growth and this horizon, and we feel very native to this. This is our city. We help make it be, you know.
The voting strength is recognized throughout America. This isn't the America that I was born into. This is America, a new people. No, a new world with new people and new ideas that we live in today.
This history of Jacksonville, as interesting as it is, does not tell the complete story. It does not tell of the poverty amidst the prosperity. It does not tell of the industrial policy which was satisfied with a low-skilled labor force. It does not tell of potential industry which examined and then passed by our community. But it does tell of a city which recognized and tried to correct its ills. It does tell of a city made up of caring, concerned citizens trying to work together to create a progressive, vibrant image of their community. And it does tell of involvement.
The people of Jacksonville seem to share a spirit, a fighting spirit, if you will. A spirit that says, these may be tough times, but we'll make it. That spirit has carried us into and through the 80s. A lot has happened since James Weldon Johnson's day, when Jacksonville was little more than a village.
By the way, that same gentleman who owned the cafe say it must have been, I can't recall the year, but it was a couple of years. He wanted to represent my district and that part of Main Street and all out east. And so he asked, say, how's that doctor's wife down the street there? They say she's very well thought of in the community. You think she'd help me? Now, he forgot all along that he had refused to let me sit until the person had made the sandwich. But those days have gone. Those days have long gone.